Hello and welcome back to the Product Launch Podcast. I'd like to welcome my guest today, Stephen Sklarew. Stephen is a product and technology executive with extensive experience building and growing companies both large and small. He is also the CEO of Synaptiq. Synaptiq provides strategic AI and data science services to information, technology, and product officers. Hello, Stephen. How are you? And thanks for being here.
Hi, Sean. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I like, for our listeners that can see the video, I like your background. You've got the guitars hanging up on the wall there. Do you collect?
I haven't played guitar for about 20 years, and then COVID hit, and I figured that's kind of the best hobby that I can get back into without having to worry about being around a lot of other people.
It's awesome. I love it. I've done actually the same. So we'll have to geek out about that as well too. But kind of before we go too much further, I'd love it if you could give our audience a little bit more information about your background so they could learn a little bit more about you.
Sure. So I've been in the technology space for about 25 years now. Started my career primarily at Ernst & Young. So I was working on very large consulting projects as a very young professional. I spent the 3 years at Ernst & Young just absorbing all the bright people's minds around me. I like to say I was kind of the dumbest person there, and I happened to be working with really sharp people that were way beyond my skills. And I worked really hard, learned as much as I could from them, and then, took off from there. But, my background is basically, 3 big companies and going on 11 startups now. So I've been in and out of, innovation inside of big companies. I've been, on executive teams building product companies. And, about a third of my career is services and the other 2/3 of products. So I've seen a lot, I've worked with a lot of great people, and I'm just excited about where technology is going and how it can help people around the world, really.
Same. I will add to that as well too. And the quote that comes to mind based on what you've said is, if you're the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room.
Yeah, right, exactly.
I love that as well
Exactly.
too. Always looking for new opportunities to learn. So spot on there. So thank you for providing the background. Part of the topic that we wanted to talk about today, with your extensive experience in building product companies and the startup experience that you have as well also, was not just building products, but in particular building data-driven products. So we're going to dive into that a little bit further. But before we get there, especially since our audience has tended to be people that have a lot of experience in product or looking to learn more about product, can you talk a little bit about how your background has been influenced by your product management experience and how that's led you to where you are today?
Sure. So really, first 10 years of my career was, an engineer. I kind of grew up through software development, starting off with Java in the 90s, and kind of moved up through, an architect and eventually a CTO. And particularly in the middle of my CTO, career, I realized that it's really frustrating building software that no one used. There's just nothing worse than, having your team work really, really hard and get really pumped up about, the software that they're delivering to find out that, users really just don't engage in it. And so I had a number of experiences, and this is probably around 2008 to 2010, where I was leading a technology team in a startup. And we worked really hard. We were building applications across 5 mobile devices. This is when iPhone just came out and Android came out. And I was kind of the fallback BlackBerry developer because no one wanted to work on that. But after several rounds of launching products and seeing, our user base really grow fast and then just completely plummet, I realized that, software is not just about the technology, it's about understanding your customers and your users. And that all those investments made in building things, can ultimately be for nothing if you don't really understand what compels users to engage with your product. So that's really when I transitioned into product management. So this was in a startup company. I was a CTO, but I just took it upon myself to learn everything I could about product management. And I had a number of people in my network that, had focused in that area. So I went from, kind of driving the technology of the company and making sure that, we were developing things on time to, doing customer research interviews and designing concepts and testing concepts. And it was a big shift in my career. But what I realized, there was so much more to learn around building the technology to make a company successful. And a lot of that had to do with understanding, your customers and the market and even the finances. So what really compelled me in product management to continue down that path was to learn all these other aspects about business, because product tends to interact with every one of those pieces. And it's an interesting role in that it's more of an influencing role than it is, direct management. So going back to my services days, it kind of gave me new opportunities to learn.
Yeah, I would certainly say that that's a huge part of the role, right? Transitioning yourself out of that, focusing almost exclusively on the technology, and now focusing as much as you can on the customer, and in particular, the opportunity to learn, which is something you've said already as well too. So agreed. Or really, I should say,
Absolutely.
couldn't agree
Yeah.
more. um, so what I'd love to kind of hear a little bit more about from you as well too, because I know we've talked about this before, is a little bit more about you building Synaptiq and what that's enabled you to be able to do when it comes to this stage where you are in your career and building additional products. I think there's a really interesting angle to that, and I think it's an absolute win-win scenario. But I'd love to hear you kind of lay out how that process has developed for you, so that we can explain it for others as well.
Sure. So I've always been an entrepreneur, but I've been a kind of conservative entrepreneur as it relates to financial risk. And I think a lot of that has to do with just, being a good father, husband, et cetera, and making sure there's kind of some stability, in our lives. So that the path for me was one of, quite a few companies, different experiences, and trying to learn as much as I could from, both proactive, reading and learning, but also, from mistakes. so, so I go back to, all these companies that I've been in, and it's like, okay, what did I learn, that can help me be a better CEO, founder, and, what would I not do based on these experiences that I've had working for other people? And so, I got to the point in my career, and this is about 5 years ago, so 20 years in, where I just felt like, every new company I joined was Groundhog's Day, right? And it was like, okay, I've been there before, and this is what I do, and I wasn't in a position to influence that completely. And so for that reason, I just, realized, and I was also in a better financial situation, I had to finally move away from kind of working for other people and start a company. And so, I have to admit, there's a lot of things I still had left to learn, right? So I'd never been a full-time salesperson, right? And I'd worked in companies where we built sales software and I managed sales systems, but actually learning what it takes to sell and going through the emotional roller coaster of sales was very new to me. So, ultimately I realized that a lot of the stress in my life came from bureaucracy, politics, and other things. And when I remove that part of my day to day, all of a sudden I have a lot more positive energy and time to learn and to grow and to serve customers.
Agreed. It's super interesting to hear you describe your journey as well too, because I know we've talked about this as well, but mine's relatively similar also. And like you said, you have the Groundhog Day effect, but then when you do take the leap, there's so much more to learn. And how you react to that, of course, can have a big impact on kind of where you go from there. You get hooked on the ability to kind of continuously learn there, and it just helps you continuously build momentum in the right direction. But there's always more to learn. And that's really where a product person should be, I would say. So good experience there too. Can you talk, we've talked about this previously, but I'd love to hear you articulate the value of taking this approach specifically for our audience. And that's, can you talk about the value in why selling services can be a great way to identify future product opportunities?
Absolutely. And this is still a work in progress, but, my experience in services earlier in my career was a joy in the diversity of work. So you work on a project, you do a lot of great stuff, and then you go on to the next project. And that diversity is a lot of fun because you learn a lot of different things, meet different people, et cetera. Um, Moving into kind of pure product companies, I think the challenge there has always been, how do you get capital before you have something that's worthy of charging money for, right? And my early experiences there were, convince people that you have something when you really don't, get their money, and then, be very careful on your cash and your clock to make sure you turn that around into some sort of fit for these investors. And, unfortunately, a lot of my experiences there were very painful. There's only so long you have to kind of prove that you can make money. And likewise, you have, a number of people that have given you money that are constantly two different sides of the world. I realized that if you could kind of bootstrap your own company through services, and when I say your own company, I mean your own products through services, then you can kind of own your own destiny, right? Now, this all sounds easy and great, but a number of companies that I worked for started services and tried to become product, and quite a few started product and fell back to services. And so I think the tough part is that they're very different business models. And if you're trying to do both and you don't have experience in both, I think it becomes very difficult to kind of do well at either one individually. And so I love the idea of bootstrapping product out of services. I think that it takes a certain type of person to be able to pull that off. And probably one of my more important learnings has been, in many cases, if you do find a product through services, you're kind of best off cleaving that out as a separate entity so that it can run as its own business model. So I don't have the magic recipe here, but what excites me about services, again, is that diversity work. And as you're doing all that diverse work, you start finding patterns in the market, right? So if you're doing projects that are solving the same problem over and over again, either within an industry or across industries, that's a good opportunity to invest a little bit more in product research and market research and determine, hey, is this a viable project to turn into a product? Now, of course, you got to be very careful about IP. A lot of services projects, you're doing work for hire, your clients own that IP, so that's something that's very important. But also you got to be careful that you don't assume that the market will buy something that a few of your clients have bought, right? So I've seen people do that before. And then, ultimately, I guess the fundamental thing I've learned between product and service is it's really not worth getting other people's money until you've proved the business model. So while I love the idea of raising capital and people celebrate it all the time, I think at the end of the day, what they should be celebrating is they found a business model that actually makes money, profits, and that's the time to get outside investment if you need it to grow faster.
Yeah, that last part is a really powerful component to it. And I think that's often fairly misunderstood in terms of understanding at what sequence to do these things. So your examples are very helpful, and I would echo them as well too. That's been very much largely my experience. And I also did have some very early, very intense lessons learned, some expensive, and some experiences that really threw me as part of kind of following what I thought were going to be the steps towards success. And like everything else, it's usually the exact opposite of that. So figured it out the hard way, but luckily still hanging around and making a lot more progress now from those intense lessons learned. So thank you for sharing that. And to kind of dive deeper into what we wanted to talk about as part of this episode as well too, you'd mentioned collecting that data, understanding those patterns, and looking for those opportunities, right? And to me, I think that's a great place to introduce what it means to be building a data-driven product with the emphasis on the data-driven component to that. Can you talk about more about, to you, what that means?
Yeah. So I guess there's two sides of this. One is, as a CEO of a company and someone that, obviously was a technologist and is now focused on data science and AI, I'm very compelled to try to understand the system and the data that drives our company. And, I think we can all empathize with this. It's hard to eat your own dog food, right? You're running really fast and, you want to be data driven, but you also, got a lot of things going on around you. So I think from one standpoint, as far as operating the company, I think it's important to get some systems in place early, and to have the cadence in place to go back and look at your data across your systems and see if you find patterns. And this is just simple data analysis, but for many companies I've worked for, they didn't even do this, right? There was no kind of unifying formula behind the company that they were trying to prove is working or not, kind of going back to that business model that we talked about earlier. So to me, data driven is about not relying 100% on data, but making sure that you have systems to collect data and that you're analyzing that data to help inform decisions, at least on a monthly basis. Now, the other side of it is more kind of data driven products. And to me, this has been a really, really interesting area. Obviously, artificial intelligence is a very hot space right now. But my learnings in the space that kind of stem back to around 2010 are that the hard part is the data. So there's lots of success stories out there, and if you dig into what it was that made them successful, it really comes down to the data that was used to train models that are now creating value. And that's really hard. So, in a number of our projects, our clients would like us to tell them upfront what the accuracy of a model will be. And the reality is that, it's a function of many things, but one of the number one things is the data that's fed into the model. And so there's a whole shift in thinking around software products as it relates to those that are driven by AI. And, we're kind of moving away from, what I call rules-based systems, if then else type stuff, to systems that are creating inferences based on the data that are fed into them. And, no longer can you give someone a requirement spec and say, hey, go build this, and you can check off each of the things that were built. It's a very much an experimental, iterative process that I think is, even more experimental than, the agile type methodologies that we're all used to. So it's incredibly fascinating, but, at the end of the day, it comes down to data. How do you collect the data? How do you label the data? How do you evaluate the data, as it's being used, and change the data? And that, it was really a new topic for most executives at this point. They don't really understand that. And that's something that we help, our clients understand and take advantage of.
Well put. And like you, I've heard data driven being used more commonly nowadays. And I think that's a good thing as well, too. Right? We start talking about how can we take from what may have been like gut or emotional decisions previously, and let's replace that with some actual data behind this, because that comes from real substance, right? But I think you've done a good job as well, too, to kind of articulate the challenges there as well. You need to, number one, you need to get the data. And number two, you need to have a certain level of quality of data. And then you have to have the process to be able to process the data, right? So be able to understand what it is that you're learning from that. So plenty of work to be done. But once you get that built the way you would like it, as you mentioned, I think the value that you get out of it is absolutely always worth kind of that investment, as you keep a relatively fluid concept of that you're going to need to maintain it, but update it moving forward as well.
Yeah, what I find fascinating in the projects that we do, in some cases, our clients know what they want to create. And so it's a matter of kind of, to your point, kind of collecting and processing and whatnot, the data. But then there's other clients that are like, hey, we have interesting data. We don't have no idea, what's in it, but can you explore it? And so I think more and more companies are realizing that they're sitting on a data asset that could be a new, revenue channel for them. But they just haven't had anyone that has deep analytical skills to find patterns and coupling that with their business domain knowledge. So that's very exciting for many companies.
Yeah, that's really cool. It's fascinating to think that people are taking that approach, but you're absolutely right? The patterns and the trends lie within the data somewhere, but we have to have the capacity to be able to extract from that, to understand what it is, to know what we can do with it. So agreed. Yeah, that's really cool. So my next question for you as well, too, is, okay, let's assume that we've kind of built this process out. It's starting to generate results from us. What's your best advice in terms of knowing how and when we have the early signs of what is a product essentially worth building?
Yeah. So this is a tough one because I feel like it's an art and a science at the same time, right? So I was mentioning this story. I think back in, I don't know, 2010 or something. We launched some products. We even got featured on the BlackBerry App Store and a couple other areas. And I remember how excited I was, seeing 25,000, 100,000 people, downloading our app, watching the numbers go up. And I was like, we finally made it, right? But then, a week later, I see all of them dropping off, right? And so, I think there's, going back to our data-driven conversation, I think part of it obviously is watching, the data of your users. I like to think of it as kind of the exhaust as they're interacting with your products. So while it's exciting to acquire lots of users, the reality, in many businesses, you need to keep them engaged, right? Because a lot of your subscription revenue comes from engagement. So that's one aspect of analysis. The other, I think, equally important is to get more of the qualitative feedback, right? So I think, as a technologist, early in my career, the last thing I wanted to do is talk to a customer, right? It's like, I want to go build this stuff. But the reality is, dipping a toe in and testing what your customers think and feel is really, really important. And unfortunately, it's not a simple process, right? Because everybody's different. And so one of the techniques that I picked up in my career was, obviously interviewing, but really looking for the emotion in the interviews, and really trying to ascertain, what one of my mentors called is the wow factors, right? What are the wows that people express in either your product today or a concept that you're pitching to them? And that's where kind of the art comes in, because sometimes it's not clear. We all communicate differently, but body language can mean a lot, expressions can mean a lot. And it's a combination of kind of both that data-driven approach and this qualitative approach of interviewing that, to me, is really critical in understanding where your product is. And what's super challenging is all this changes over time. So you can't just do this, once a year and think everything's great. Given how fast our market's moving, I kind of go back to, product research is really, kind of a monthly or at minimum a quarterly process. And, before you know it, a competitor can pop up with, something that is much more compelling than you have and, take away all your customers. So, I like to think of it as, a never ending process. And, the times that I've been involved in kind of monolithic research, it doesn't continue to provide value after a certain period of time, right? It decays, just given the market. And so I think it's really important to have that product research and market research component always tied in. And then from a product management perspective, looking at that exhaust data regularly.
Yeah, you've hit on a very important, more of the kind of advanced concept when it comes to product management that I would definitely want listeners to take away from this conversation, in that not just your market, but your product are both dynamic, and they should be. So you build the process, and if you're following the process correctly and you're getting the kind of value out of it, you will understand not just where the market is and where your product is, but the gap between the two. And then you'll be working to reduce that as much as possible moving forward, because like you said, it's a process. It's not a milestone. You're not looking to kind of achieve that, put a flag in the ground and, okay, we're done. Now we just sit back and collect. That's not how it works. That's how, like you said, innovation ends up disrupting and then unseating you. So you have to build the process, but then you have to maintain it as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of talk about kind of minimum viable products, right? And I think everybody kind of understands that acronym. But at the end of the day, it's actually really hard to define what a minimum viable product is. And, I bring this up because I think a number of mistakes I've made in my career around product management was more features equals better product, right? And, we think about the word MVP, you're trying to figure out, okay, what's that minimum feature set, right, that will get the customers engaged. And at the end of the day, it's not really about the feature set, right? It's about the value you're creating for them. And so we have lots of discussions about, how deep or shallow to be in certain feature areas and how wide or narrow. But again, it's about the experience the person has, the value they get, and it could be, one simple feature that's just amazing, and the experience around that feature is so engaging that they want to keep coming back. So there's many facets, I feel, and that's got me really excited about, customer experience overall as kind of this umbrella of value that goes beyond the technology product.
Yeah, very well put. And I want to thank you for being here, Stephen. But before I let you go, I have a couple questions for you. The first is, what resources would you share with our audience about any of this subject matter, or more about Synaptiq, or anything where they can go to learn more?
Sure. So first of all, I used to read a lot of books, and my favorite, kind of back in the day was Good to Great. I really liked the concept of getting the right people on the bus. So if you haven't read that, that's a great one. But more recently, I've been involved in startup groups and working with other CEOs and putting processes in place. And probably the number one is this book called Traction. So this is just a really great book in how to design and operate your business based on best practices and put in processes that help you measure, kind of going back to that data-driven stuff. How do you actually measure your company? And that kind of leads on to Scaling Up, which is also kind of in that same vein. Another great book for entrepreneurs that want to start businesses. And then lastly, I recently met the author of this book called The 3-Hag Way. But I think one of the challenges we have as entrepreneurs is we have this grand vision, right? And it's great to think about, like an exit strategy and acquisition, or how you're going to make billions of dollars or whatever. But at the end of the day, it's like really difficult to plot a course to get there and then stay on top of your plan and operate it. And this 3-Hag Way has a lot of really great ideas there. As far as Synaptiq, our website is Synaptiq, synaptiq.ai. We've got a lot of great resources up there. We just finished up a summer webinar series around primarily healthcare innovation. So we talked about COVID and diagnostics, really interesting topics. And we have a webinar actually next week on UX and AI. So I think there's, this view right now that AI is just kind of a back-end data thing, right? But at the end of the day, like delivering these, recommendations or predictions without a great user experience kind of misses the mark. So there's some great resources there. Would love to share them with everybody here and see what you think.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing. There's some really excellent books. I'm going to vote for all of those as well too. And then I will also link to those Synaptiq resources. So thank you for providing those. And then the last question I have for you is, who should reach out to you and how can they get in touch?
Yeah, so, I'm having lots of conversations. As I mentioned earlier, I wasn't really a sales guy until about 5 years ago, and now I'm really enjoying it. So whether it's, people that are interested in growing their careers in AI, I love talking to those type of people, giving some career advice, even networking, but, certainly from a business sales perspective, we're looking around for, CTOs, chief product officers, CIOs that are trying to drive innovation in their organizations. And while they may have an engineering team in place, they perhaps don't have the skills specifically in data strategy and data science and AI. And those are the type of people we'd like to talk about project opportunities. So to reach out to me, it's just Stephen, STEPHEN, at synaptiq.ai. Again, it's synaptiq.ai.
Thank you much for providing that, Stephen. We'll link to that in the notes as well too. And thank you for being here and sharing your knowledge and experience with both myself and our audience.
Great. Thanks for having me, Sean. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Product Launch Podcast powered by Next Step. If you or anyone you know is involved in scaling a B2B SaaS business, please have them reach out to me about becoming a potential guest on our show. They can email me at sean@nextstep.io. That's SEAN@nxtstep.io. This time, we'd like to take a moment to thank the sponsor of our show, Next Step Consulting. Would you like to know what the right next steps are for your B2B SaaS business? Are you trying to grow and scale, but you're stuck? We can help. To find out how Next Step can help your B2B SaaS business achieve its goals, please email me, sean@nextstep.io. That's SEAN@nxtstep.io. Thanks, and keep disrupting.